Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I am here to discuss with us topic 1.4 as well as 1.5. Continuing our discussion on Unit 1 topics, we're now going to dive into what's called the biogeochemical cycles. If we break that word down, right, we know that the prefix bio refers to living things, while geo refers to earth, and chemical would refer to things like elements or compounds. And so here we're going to talk about the most common nutrients that get cycled through ecosystems, through living things and non living things. So one of those is specifically looking at carbon, right? All living things are going to contain a form of carbon. Now, what you need to know about the carbon cycle is when carbon does cycle through living or non living things, it can take the form of many different carbon compounds. Some parts of the carbon cycle may hold on to those carbon compounds for long periods of time, while others may be relatively short. That's where we're going to get into this a discussion of what is a source versus, say, a sink, right? Something that would be a sink of carbon would be something on Earth that holds carbon for very long periods of time, stores it, versus a source is usually where we might find carbon for a short period of time. Two processes that are really, really important in the carbon cycle are both photosynthesis and cell respiration. These are two processes that are done by living organisms that help to cycle carbon from the atmosphere through living things and through non living things. You'll also find that both plant and animal decomposition is also a process, a part of the carbon cycle, and the burning of fossil fuels, which is a human activity that is going to impact the carbon cycle. So, as I mentioned before, two fluxes or processes that are key components of the carbon cycle is both photosynthesis and cell respiration. My recommendation would be to definitely know these equations. There has been questions in the past on the AP exam that have asked students to provide what those equations may be. Thinking back to bio, right, we know that organisms that perform photosynthesis are classified as producers or autotrophs. That can be anything like a plant, algae, and even some bacteria. During photosynthesis, they capture solar energy, use water and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to change then that CO2 into glucose, C6H12O6, as well as produce oxygen as a byproduct. It is then other living organisms that perform cell respiration that is going to then use that glucose that has energy stored, break those bonds in the presence of oxygen, and then produce CO2. So we can kind of see that cycle happening there. So what does that kind of look like on a more like grand scale? Well, we know that our atmosphere is going to be a source of CO2. We can see, right, many different arrows kind of pointing towards the atmosphere here. We know that plants or photosynthesizers in this case are going to capture that CO2, change it into glucose, use it as food, as well as produce that CO2 via respiration. We know that those plants and animals eventually will die and decompose. That's where portions of that carbon will then become a part of the earth. Through many, many, many years and burial and pressure and time, we can see that some of that organic matter or carbon can actually be compressed into fossil fuels like oils, natural gases, and coal. Through human activity, we can extract those via mining, combust those fossil fuels to produce more CO2 into the atmosphere to kind of start the cycle all over again. What people often forget is how the ocean is involved in the carbon cycle. As you can see here, we see an exchange of CO2 from the atmosphere, and it actually then dissolves into the water. Here we can see Photosynthesizers or producers in the ocean can capture that CO2 and perform those kind of same cycles that we see on land, we can see also in the ocean or aquatic ecosystems as well. So if we were to kind of break down the processes involved here, we know that photosynthesis overall takes in, right, captures CO2 from the atmosphere. Those producers fix and incorporate that carbon into their tissues. Respiration is where carbon dioxide is going to be returned to the atmosphere because now organisms are consuming that glucose that's being made. We see an exchange between our ocean and atmosphere of CO2. Sedimentation, that would be our process after decomposition takes place, right? Organisms decompose. That carbon then becomes a part of the earth, and over time, with pressure, we can see then calcium carbonate sediment form. Through then human activity, we can see extraction or the removal of fossil fuels, and eventually their combustion for energy purposes releases CO2. So, what might be two major impacts to the carbon cycle? One would obviously be the combustion of fossil fuels, right? We're now taking carbon that hasn't been present for millions of years and now putting it back up into the atmosphere. And two, deforestation, right? Harvesting trees. We are now eliminating a sink of carbon. And so now the more and more trees we tend to cut down, the less CO2 we see being captured. And with those then trees decomposing, we see more CO2 being emitted. Right. Now moving on to topic 1.5. This is looking at specifically the nitrogen cycle. So similar to the carbon cycle, we tend to see nitrogen in many different forms throughout it being in living things as well as non-living things. And a key piece of the nitrogen cycle is a process known as nitrogen fixation. Because what you'll find as we continue to discuss the nitrogen cycle is we as living organisms, right, as consumers, we cannot actually take in the nitrogen found into the atmosphere and readily use it. There are several steps involved that must happen first before we can actually use that then nitrogen. Okay. So looking a little bit more in depth at our steps of the nitrogen cycle, we can see that the nitrogen in the atmosphere is typically in the form of N2 or dinitrogen gas. And actually, majority of our atmosphere is going to be made up of that form of nitrogen. But unfortunately, we can't use it in that form, and nor can plants. So there is a very, very important step that must take place before any other living organism can obtain that nitrogen and fix it. So that's where we get nitrogen fixation. Now, there are two ways in which nitrogen can be fixed, biotically or abiotically. Abiotically, nitrogen can be fixed by lightning or combustion, potentially. When that takes place, we can see the N2 or dinitrogen gas be converted into nitrates or NO3s. Biotically, we can see that N2 can be converted into ammonia or NH3. That typically takes place via bacteria that might be located in the soil or even some bacteria that reside in the root nodules of specific types of plants. Now, once we see that take place, we can now have producers potentially take up those now chemical compounds of nitrogen. So now we see, right, that ammonia is in the form of that NH3, or we have our nitrates in the form of NO3. So producers, via a process called assimilation, can now take that up in the form of ammonium or NH4, or nitrates, that NO3. How might we obtain our nitrogen as consumers? We actually have to eat those plants. And the reason why we need that nitrogen is if you think back to bio, nitrogen is going to be found in all of our proteins as well as our DNA. And so we do require nitrogen in order to survive. Now, what happens when those producers or consumers wind up dying? They're going to decompose in the soil through a process called ammonification. So, this is where now those biological nitrogen compounds get changed into ammonium or NH4. Now, how is that ammonium going to be changed into other forms like nitrite or nitrate? That is with, once again, bacteria, except this time they're called nitrifying bacteria. They're going to take the ammonium, NH4, and change it, turn it into nitrites, NO2, or nitrates, NO3. It is typically producers or plants that tend to like to take in nitrogen in the form of nitrates. So that is why nitrification is a key process in the nitrogen cycle. Now, we've talked a lot about how we might take nitrogen from the atmosphere, we cycle it through living things. How might it return back to the atmosphere? That would be through denitrification. So, this is now another type of bacteria found in the soil known as denitrifying bacteria. We can find them in very oxygen poor soils or maybe in stagnant water. They're going to actually convert that nitrates, those NO3s, into nitrous oxide, N2O, and eventually into nitrogen gas or N2 to kind of start our cycle all over again. So, what are some human activities that might impact the nitrogen cycle? That would specifically be the addition of fertilizers. Now, obviously, fertilizers aren't all bad, right? We know that farmers tend to add them to their crops in order to ensure that their crops grow, right? Because nitrogen as well as phosphorus are two nutrients that are limiting to plants' growth. But when we add an excess of nitrogen to the soil, that's going to alter our distribution or abundance of the species that may reside there. So some organisms may be better adapted for that new nitrogen intake, and some are not. And so we're potentially going to see some survive in this case, while others may perish due to excess nitrogen. All right, everyone, that is the end of our video here. You want to make sure as you watched, you took your notes. Please provide a question that you have about this video for me to answer in class.